This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is American poet Walt Whitman, his life and career. I have three experts and we'll be speaking about that in a moment. Walt Whitman is the subject, the author of Leaves of Grass, in my opinion, the most important and influential poet in the English language, if not the greatest. I have David Reynolds, David Blake, and Ed Folsom, people who have written about Whitman, his life and career. So let me start with David Reynolds and ask you a little bit of background about yourself, what drew you to Whitman initially, and any works that you've written about him.
Well, I was an undergraduate major in American literature, American studies. I just got interested in Walt Whitman, from a fairly young age, from college age, and then in grad school, I got my PhD in American Studies, and then I became very interested in Walt Whitman and his age. I was the director of the Walt Whitman Center at Rutgers Camden. Whitman died in Camden, and then I wrote several books, one of which, Beneath the American Renaissance, studies Whitman and other writers in terms of its popular culture, and then I wrote a book called Walt Whitman's America.
Yeah, I've got that book.
Which sort of extended that study. It was like a cultural biography of Whitman. And then I edited a sort of a facsimile edition of the 1855 Leaves of Grass, and I wrote a short book on Whitman for Oxford University Press as well. So I'm interested in a lot of other writers as well, but I think among poets, he's my favorite, really. And I always kind of return to him, not just because of his poetry, but because of his historical meanings and his incredibly observant commentary on 19th century America and on American life. So, yes, it's his poetry that really lives, but his commentary is just incredible. And people like Abraham Lincoln, for example. It's wonderful, really.
Okay, thank you. I'll go on to David Blake. Next time, David, could you just speak maybe about 10 or 20% louder, though, just for the webcam. But anyway, David Blake is my next guest. David, could you give a little bit of background about yourself as well, and anything that you have written about Walt Whitman?
Sure. So my name's David Blake. I'm a professor of English at the College of New Jersey. I'm the author of Walt Whitman and the Culture of American Celebrity. And the co-editor of a book called Walt Whitman, Where the Future Becomes Present, which came out of a conference that my colleague Michael Robertson and I organized here at the college. I was not a big fan of Walt Whitman in undergraduate school, but when I didn't really think of Whitman until I went abroad, spent some time in Europe. Somehow being in Europe and being in this different landscape, really all of a sudden, all I wanted to do was read Whitman. It made me very aware of my national identity. It made me very aware of Whitman's national identity. And so that became really a turning point for me. Somebody who had always been interested in poetry, but not interested in Whitman. And after that, I kept reading more and more and more, and eventually, wrote books on Whitman.
Well, as we go on, I want you to speak a bit more about the celebrity aspect. One of the reasons I pick certain individuals to ask is because of their unique takes on it. And certainly we'll talk about his poetry and the Civil War and whatnot, but I also want to touch upon your subject matter regarding celebrity. Ed Folsom is my third guest. Ed, if you could also give a little bit of background about yourself as well as what you have written about Whitman.
Sure. At the University of Iowa, and like David Blake, an undergraduate, I really had very little encounter with. In fact, I took a course in American Romantic. Was told by we would not be studying Whitman in American. We'd get him in realists. So I took American realists. Saying we're not going to study Whitman in this course because you get him in romantics. I remember at the time, well, this is interesting. This is a poet who fits everywhere and a poet that seems to have an association with everyone and no one wants to really confront him. And I went to graduate school without studying.
In fact, I think Whitman is the only major American writer that to me. And in a lot of ways, I think what drew me to him, I got to Whitman. I came to the University of Iowa as a 20th century scholar and taught 20th century poetry. It was really through dealing with 20th century American poets that I kept getting more and more fascinated with the mysterious figure of Whitman, because they always would have to have an encounter with Whitman at some point, some major engagement with Whitman. They would write a poem to Whitman, essay about Whitman, and I was fascinated with how every American poet in his or her career had to grips with this guy Whitman. Several graduate students at Iowa finally convinced me to teach a seminar where we deal with American poetry in relation to Whitman, and that's when I began reading Whitman, and I've now written, co-edited over a dozen books on Whitman. But the first one was called Walt Whitman, the Made Wrong. It was investigating how 20th century writers responded to Walt Whitman, talked back to him.
Just so you know, Ed, your audio is blinking in and out a little bit, so I don't know if you're aware of that, but hopefully it'll get better as we go on. Well, let me start with Walt Whitman himself. Whitman was born in 1819. He's almost a near contemporary, or almost an exact contemporary of Herman Melville. He was born, I guess, on Long Island. Did he come from a middle-class family, a poor family? Was they farmers? I know he became a journalist. I don't know if maybe let me start with David Reynolds if you want to tackle the background of Whitman before Leaves of Grass.
Well, one side of Whitman's family was English and one side was Dutch, and both of them kind of met. Those two sides kind of met in the middle of Long Island. And at one time, the family had actually owned quite a lot of acreage on Long Island, and in fact, was farmed by slaves. But his father was a carpenter, really, who actually built what became the Walt Whitman birthplace, which is still a marvelous place to visit, by the way. It's in West Hills, Long Island, which is just south of Huntington. And then at the age of 3, the father took the family, Walt and his siblings, to live in Brooklyn. And so Walt was basically raised in Brooklyn. And his father struggled with the bottle. I think that he's been overly maybe demonized by some biographers, but he because I think that but there's no doubt that Walt had a thing about his mother that perhaps he didn't have about his father, so to speak. I don't think we can turn that into a big Oedipal complex as Freudian biographers have done, but he kind of idealized his mother Louisa, who was of Quaker background, and the father tended to be more of a deist or a rationalist. And the father did struggle with alcohol, and finally died in the 1850s. And as Walt grew, he more and more took the ferry over to Manhattan across the East River. And it was really those jaunts over to Manhattan that really exposed him to the rapidly growing city. Before actually becoming a journalist in Manhattan, he served as he went back to Long Island for a while and was a roving school teacher in one-room schoolhouses at various parts of. He also briefly edited a newspaper on Long Island. So he had many different jobs, mainly as a teacher and a newspaper writer, and then kind of rattled around really as a journalist in Manhattan for about 15 more years before emerging as really the greatest poet, or one of the greatest poets that America has seen.
And
that whole transformation from a journalistic background to becoming a major poet is something that maybe we'll never know completely how it happened or why it happened, but we all take a stab at trying to explain that.
And it should be noted that Brooklyn and Manhattan, or New York City, then were separate cities at that time. It wasn't until the end of the 19th century that they became one. So there was sort of, it was sort of like a rivalry. I know Brooklynites didn't consider themselves New York Cityites at that time as well. Let me turn to David Blake. Since you wrote about celebrity, it's interesting that Whitman did turn out as a journalist, but this was really, I think, before yellow journalism of the late 19th century. What about Whitman do you think drove him into publishing, as far as, at least as far as journalism? Was it, and I mean, how does that fit into your thesis of celebrity?
Well, Whitman had been apprenticed to a journalist in a printing house, and so that as a young man, he was involved in the production of print, and he knew how to lay type, and he knew all about paper and bookmaking. One of the things that I think is really significant about his work as a newspaper editor, as well as reporter, but particularly editor, is the way that the papers were constructed in those days. If you look at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which was one of the papers that Whitman edited, the first page largely is a page of advertisements, and then you turn in and the stories are there. But that sense of like putting together a paper that is surrounded by advertisement. Many of these advertisements were recurring in issue after issue. But I think that's very important that there's this cloak of advertisement, which is the cloak of publicity, meaning it's the cloak of being public. That is something that was very much a part of his growth when he thought about addressing a community, which the Brooklyn Daily Eagle very much did. Whitman had a very good, strong sense of who his readers were and what their values were and what their habits were, what their concerns were. And I think he rather miraculously transferred that into his poetry. It just became a much larger stage. But that inclusiveness of the paper is something that's very significant.
Well, let me turn to Ed Folsom. People know that Whitman was a journalist, and if you have ever seen some of his pre-Leaves of Grass poetry, it's terribly mawkish in the kind of way that a lot of American poetry at the time was. And as we're recording this here in March of 2017, it was only about a month or so ago that an early novel, a serialized novel, I guess third or fourth rate Dickensian type novel of his was uncovered. What was Whitman creatively doing aside from the journalism in his pre-Leaves of Grass day, Ed?
Well, that's really pretty interesting about Whitman's journalistic career is that not only is he writing, typically think of as journalism, he was also writing poetry and fiction, published in newspapers. In fact, poetry and fiction were a significant part of his career, and poetry and were major parts of 19th newspaper makeup. So Whitman was quite involved in creative work in those years before he started Leaves of Grass, and in fact, it's by following his development as newspaper poet that we can see the first inklings of the poetry that would become the poetry we now associate with Whitman. By the 1850s, he was publishing politically charged, quite radical form poetry. And the novel that was discovered, I'd probably put it second rate rather than third or fourth. But I think it's a really interesting novel because it's a piece of fiction that we have by Whitman that was written at the same time that he was also writing the poetry in Grass. And I think we can see the fiction and the poetry beginning to mingle in ways that we'd not been aware of before. The last piece of fiction we had, published piece of fiction before the discovery of this novel was 1888. So there was always this kind of 7-year gap between his fiction career and his Leaves of Grass career. But that gap has now disappeared, and we can see that he was still really, as he indicated in his notes, struggling with what the form of this new literary discovery that he was making, what form it was going to take. And I think one of the interesting things about this novel is you can actually see toward the end of the novel picking up fiction and turning to something else that early readers would recognize as poetry. Often Whitman would come very quickly to call poetry. And it's still, I think, an interesting problem for biographers, and I think this new discovery of the novel will make this early 1850s period all the more interesting to investigate.
Well, let me throw the next question out to all of you, and whoever wants to jump in first can. Let's talk about mid-19th century poetry, at least in the English language and specifically American. Really, we had maybe Emerson, Edgar Allan Poe had, written some of his most famous poems by then, but there wasn't anything that I guess most people would say was definingly American, either in content nor style. You could argue maybe that someone like William Blake, in some of his long prophetic poems, anticipated some of the long rolling styles that Whitman later did, where any ideas of meter are dashed. What do you think sparked Whitman out of, we might call this intellectual torpor? And I mean, do we know what made him sort of just have that eruption of the original 1855 Leaves of Grass? And any one of you?
Well, probably we'll never know for sure. I mean, there have been all kinds of theories that perhaps he had a homosexual coming out during this period, or some kind of psychological crisis, or some kind of mystical revelation. My feeling is that he had been in part a political journalist, a Democratic editor and Democratic journalist, and he wrote at a time when he saw the nation falling apart and over slavery. And one of the very first scribblings in his notebooks was, I'm the poet of slaves and of the masters of slaves. I enter into both. I come between both. And I think he fashioned this persona, this first person, to kind of encompass both sides of the slavery issue, and more than that, really various parts of the Union, of the nation. And the nation was just about 11 southern states were soon going to leave the nation. And he was very concerned over it. He didn't like abolitionists because they wanted to divide the nation. He didn't like secessionists because they wanted to divide the nation. So he fashions this all-encompassing first person, and he creates kind of what he calls the new Bible. He really hopes that he has almost utopian feeling at the beginning that maybe people will respond to his poetry, and he'll be absorbed by his country, and it will have a healing effect. However, what happened, of course, is that he literally almost had to give away the first 1,000 copies of Leaves of Grass, and so the reception was really not what he saw, but he kept going and going and retrying and trying different formats and so forth, and never really giving up until his death. He always sort of believed in poetry.
I had mentioned in one of my emails to all of you that I considered Whitman what I call a bottleneck poet, in that one could look at all of his works, all of the works of people sort of leading up to someone like him, but then he comes along, and then everything in poetry, certainly in the English language, and it's even spread out to other languages now, what we would consider modern poetry begins really with Whitman. So let me ask either David Blake or Ed Folsom to comment on that. Is it pretty clear to me, but would you agree that Whitman is at least, if not the greatest poet, certainly probably the most important poet that's published in terms of his effect and his catalyzing effect in changing what poetry was to what it became after. Either David Blake or Ed Folsom, do you want to comment?
Ed, you want to take that?
Sure. Yes, I would certainly agree with that. I don't think there's anything like it in any other poetic tradition, and certainly not in American poetry, of a 160-year tradition of poets back to Walt Whitman. Every American poet at some point, some way, has to come to grips. And part of the reason for that is that Whitman set his poetry up rest to future generations. Poetry that is based on two characters that he invents, the I and the you, and that you is set up in Whitman's to be a you that exists long after Whitman. And writers, not just poets, but artists across the board, novelists, screenwriters, writers of television series, architects like Lloyd Wright, have all responded Whitman and talked back to it. I think this sense that was generated in the early years of 20th century about Whitman having this momentous change in the 1850s that produced Leaves of Grass is one of the things that has been undermined in recent decades by access to Whitman's manuscripts and notebooks that we had not had before that are not available to everyone on the online Whitman archive. And rediscovery of some of his journalism and early fiction and poetry that had been before, we can now actually begin to track and trace a gradual evolution of Whitman into that 1855 poet. We can see it wasn't a sudden overnight change or shift, but a gradual change that came with Whitman's embrace of oratory and journalism and intense self-examination in his journals. So it's not in my estimation an overnight change, but a fascinating, trackable evolution.
And along with all three of your web pages, I'll link to the Whitman archive so people can look through that as well below this video. Let me turn to David Blake. Since you've written about celebrity, Walt Whitman, one of his most famous poems, and certainly his longest, A Song of Myself, originally it was titled just, well, I think it was Untitled in the first edition, and then it became Walt Whitman, and then it became Song of Myself. And so here we have, as Ed was mentioning, the I and the you. Here's the person basically making himself and his ideas and his beliefs and his achings and longings fodder for art in a much more intimate way than anyone else had ever done. So let me turn to the idea of celebrity. Do you think that Whitman, and I guess the terms weren't codified then by Freud, id, ego, and superego, that Whitman at some point just said, fuck it, and I'm going to talk about myself and what I want and whatnot. And do you think that opening himself up as the main subject was part of what made him, and let's talk how that may have affected celebrity culture, since now everyone's obsessed by everything that comes out of every orifice of theirs?
That's quite a question, Dan.
Yeah.
So let me tackle it this way: so Whitman is writing about the self, but in many ways we have to understand he's writing more about the idea of the self and the idea of the individual than writing about himself, Walt Whitman, right? I mean, even the name Walt Whitman is a coinage of his. He's not Walter Whitman Jr. As the book is copywritten under. And if you were to go through, I mean, people like David and Ed can go through and they can pull out passages that are autobiographical. But your average reader of that poem is not going to come out of this and say, oh, okay, here's his beginning, here's his childhood, here's this moment of crisis. So Whitman's notion of self is so comprehensive, and it's representative of all selves, right? In that one, there is the many, and that really is sort of the central dynamic there. All of those yous, all those readers who are caught up inside his eye. So one of the things to remember about this time period is there are a lot of people who are also trying to write great American poetry. We don't necessarily recognize them as having the great influence that Whitman has. But de Tocqueville came to the United States, and he looked at democracy, and he said, well, the source of art in a democracy is going to be the individual, is going to be the self. So he's writing that long before Whitman, and Emerson is thinking about that before Whitman. But Whitman ends up being the person with the magic formula, let's say, that allows for this to be, again, something that's rooted in the self, but it becomes so comprehensive that the self becomes almost sort of diffused over all of us.
Famously as well, Whitman did something that is very much in touch with modern celebrity culture. He sent out a handful of his books for reviews, and most famously, or infamously, depending on how you view on it, Ralph Waldo Emerson had some words of praise for it, and then immediately Whitman took that, ran with it, put the words of praise in the book. He also wrote reviews about himself pseudonymously in a lot of journals and papers as well. So let me just talk about that. This was a guy who, certainly had the sense that he was, I guess, destined for something great, and had no abashedness about using Emerson's quote without the permission, and also, as I said, pseudonymously reviewing himself.
That's right. Well, Whitman said the public is a thick-skinned beast, and you have to keep hitting it until it knows you're there. And those anecdotes about Emerson and the anonymous reviews are just legendary in American literature. But they weren't peculiar to him. Other people are involved in the same kind of self-promotion. He embraced these kinds of activities, but they were very much a part of the 1840s and the 1850s. So this is the age of Barnum. This is the age of hoopla. This is the age of people sort of creating happenings for the purpose of publicity. And so Whitman was very much a part of his time in that way.
Well, let me talk about the... Okay. Go ahead, Ed.
I think it's interesting to add here that to what David's suggesting, that Whitman was picking up on cultural with hype and self-publicity and applying it to the literary world. The Emerson letter that you mentioned, the infamous use of that letter in the 1856 edition of Blades of Grass, part of the use of the letter was Whitman's invention of the cover blurb. He puts a line from Emerson's letter without Emerson's permission on the spine of the book, 1856 edition. I greet you at the beginning of a great career, R.W. Emerson. And it becomes our first cover blurb in book history. I mean, Whitman is inventing literary in a way that had not been done before.
Well, let's talk about the poetry itself. Let me start back with David Reynolds. I mentioned how fundamentally different it was. I know years ago I wrote an essay about Robinson Jeffers where I really, I've never found the idea of meter convincing. If a thing is enunciated, it certainly isn't unstressed. So there's that false binary. And Whitman seemed to have been the guy who said, that's just all bullshit. And, if you listen to some of the lesser poems of even a great poet like Edgar Allan Poe, or if I've talked with many Shakespearean actors who say the thing they hate the most about Shakespeare is that people do not normally speak like this. And Whitman said, I'm just going to write poems the way people actually speak. He will use some archaisms, the thys or whatnot, but pretty much he basically let things come out in these sort of breath-long, eructations. What do you think is the advantage of that, especially as it comes to the subject matter, David Reynolds? Let me ask you.
Well, I think he really follows the rhythms of voice and of speech, which is not to say he is totally without. I mean, some people actually scanned his poetry and so forth. So, I mean, it does follow certain rhythms, and particularly, obviously, a poem like "Oh Captain, My Captain," which is a very traditional, conventional poem. But most of his poetry really gave birth to what later became free verse. It was natural. It was based on a kind of Emersonian organic view of poetry. Emerson himself didn't quite achieve it in his own poetry, but Whitman came along and it was inspired to make poetry follow the rhythms of voice, of feeling, and he liked to vocalize. He loved to go to orators. He would go to different preachers, sermons, and it really, didn't matter which denomination or whatever, or hear political speeches. And then when he wrote his poetry, he often wrote on little scraps of paper, and then would read them aloud, actually read them aloud. And he enjoyed sort of orating on the omnibuses of the time and sort of reciting Shakespeare at the top of his lungs and so forth, and using his voice. And in a way, that was part of his revolution, his stylistic revolution.
Ed, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I add to the what David has said about the oratory and how crucial it was. And I've always been struck by descriptions of 19th century oratory of listeners at oratorical events that would talk about the crowd keeping, and then you read the speeches in the newspapers and they seem incredibly dead, and you can't quite imagine how these speeches were brought to life. One thing I think Whitman does on the page is he actually puts oratory on the page that the reader begins to hear and feel the oratorical lines by finding the way Whitman did and by following a kind of oratorical ride following speech. You get the sense of Whitman actually inventing a kind of speech on the page that is part of what makes the poetry seem so personal and intense. It's not like you're reading something that has been left on the page. It's more like you're reading something that is taking place on the page as you're reading it.
Yeah. Let me ask you. Go ahead, Dave.
Can I add something to that? We talk about Whitman as the great poet of the body, and many times we're doing that when we're thinking about it in terms of his content matter. But I think that the sense of oratory and organizing the lines by breath and by phrase is one of those ways where we might think more about Whitman as a poet of the body, because as the language comes alive on the page and comes alive in the reader, it's involving the body. It's in drawing the body into the rhythms and the breathing patterns of the poet. And that's a remarkable thing that he's able to achieve there.
I had mentioned some of the. Go ahead.
Like Charles Wilson and Allen Ginsberg and the whole invention of breath poetics that in the second half of the 20th century is those are all poets who look back as the inspiration for that, quite literally the inspiration, taking it back to the root words of the breathing poet. So I think David's absolutely right about that.
I had mentioned some of the archaisms, the thys and the shalls that Whitman used. I want to talk about a little, I think, talked about aspect of Whitman. And I know that I have read here and there that Whitman did feel himself drawn to the King James Version of the Bible. And I'm wondering to what degree do you think that he was trying to maybe write in a biblical sense, sort of a new world Bible, because we talk about prophets, we talk about Vedic poetry, certainly with someone like Blake, but Whitman seems to be, to me, even more radically a prophetic or a Vedic poet than Blake was, because he is talking about things of the new world. He's talking about lands uncharted. He's talking about things typically American. He talks about ideas of the ways people communicate. He's got much more of that demotic sense than Blake did. Anyone? Let me just start with David. Do you think that the King James Bible had an influence, say, with the use, the deliberate use?
Yeah, Whitman once referred to his to Leaves of Grass as the new Bible, and actually, when you think of it, the poetry of the Bible, in some senses, comes closest to the rhythms of his own, because it's not rhymed and metered and so forth, and yet it's very rhythmic at its best. I think that he was absolutely influenced by the Bible and by sermons that he heard, and also, but his Vedic nature has to do with American democracy. And he says, mine is the greatest of faiths and the least of faiths. And what he meant by that was that it's the least in the sense of really adhering to any particular religion or any particular creed, but the greatest in the sense of the belief in the divinity of both every man and every woman, but also of every part of nature. A mouse is miracle enough to stagger sextillions of infidels. A mouse. And my armpit odor is finer than any prayer. And the natural world itself becomes miraculous. So in creating a new Bible, it's a truly democratic, radically democratic kind of Bible that tries to locate miracles everywhere. And this wasn't really easy for him. He had several problems within his family, siblings who had quite serious issues, either mental issues or issues with alcohol. So we can't just, and he lived in a very, very difficult time of slavery and all that. So we can't just say, oh, he lived in a rosy time and he had a happy family, and wasn't necessarily like that whatsoever. But he once said, I stand for the cheerful conclusions. I stand for the cheerful conclusions. And it also involved both the body and the material world and the soul. He once said in older life that if we didn't have a notion, at least, of an afterlife, then the world would be meaningless. So he at least sort of liked to cling to a notion of the soul going on, although he had no really idea about a particular kind of heaven or something like that.
And I think in relation to that, it's important to think about Whitman's comments. The later part of his career talked about how the poets of democracy, the poet of death, and it's fascinating to think about what Whitman could have meant by that statement, because he understood that religions gained their power by portals to death. Right? They could create an image of what happened at death, made death bearable, and was looking for a much more depth notion of death, something he picked up from Bryant's Thanatos, the notion that death is simply a word we put endless recycling of life. And recycling of life becomes the new faith. I think Whitman's greatest faith ultimately was that we would be here in 2007 reading him, that we would be here, all would be living, breathing, reading beings, and that faith in the future, that faith that he and everyone who lived at his time would be recycled into us, who were mere spirit imagined was alive, but now are blood breathing, reading individuals. That's his great faith. It's the faith he based his poetry on. That's why the future.
David,
you've mentioned William Blake a couple times, and I think it's worth sort of taking a minute to compare and contrast the two in their line and in their spirituality. And Blake was somebody who was writing about America. He hadn't come to America, but he had written a prophetic book called America. He had written the Visions of the Daughters of Albion, which takes place in America. It's really a captivity narrative and a slave narrative combined. But Blake's work always depends on these sort of demigods. Prophecy is about the demigods. It's almost, and I don't mean this disrespectfully at all, but it's almost like the first comic books. I mean, he's got these superhero demigods who fly in over space and time and represent these sort of great spiritual powers. And what Whitman does, and I'm just sort of agreeing with Ed and David here, is he turns all of that Vedic energy, all of that spiritual revelation into this world, right? And this is why Ed's, realism class and romanticism class, both say, well, Whitman was in the other group because he fits in both groups in a way that many of the romantic poets, wouldn't be able to do. The nature of revelation is something that's happening here in our time and in future times, and something that's happening perpetually. And I think that's just so important.
Yeah, one of his lines is, there is no more heaven than there is now. There is no more hell than there is now. And, heaven and hell are going on right now. And he preferred, it's not that he overlooked the hell, the dark places at all, because he didn't. Some of his poems are quite dark. But ultimately, we looked at him for optimism, I think. And consolation.
And we think too of Blake's marriage of heaven and I think are very, very close. Whitman's seeing all heaven and all hell, and I've always been struck. Whitman's British admirers immediately relationship between Blake and Whitman. That's where they went. Writers like Swinburne and William Michael Rossetti and Anne Gilchrist, the remarkable woman who came to America to bear Whitman children. She was Blake's first biographer, and she actually finished first biography. So there's at the beginning a remarkable convergence between Blake and the minds of his British admirers.
I want to talk about an aspect of Whitman that I don't know that a lot of people have touched on, and it's about perspective and it's about self-awareness. When you think of postmodernism, which came a full century after Whitman, there's the idea that we know that this art, whether it's writing, whether it's a film, is an artifice. If you watch Ingmar Bergman films of the 1960s, you see a lot of this. But there's the famous line in Emerson's essay, I think it's Nature, where he says, "I became a transparent eyeball." And Whitman, though, is an eyeball, but he's certainly not transparent. He's there. But unlike epopee or long poetry, say Wordsworth, Tintern Abbey, Whitman is always there. He is always watching. There's no illusion that we are along with the characters and experiencing with them. we are always behind them, behind the eyes of Whitman. I'm just looking at Brooklyn, crossing Brooklyn Ferry, and there's so many saw, and I looked, and I saw, and I watched. It's always the act of watching, of observation, not just being there, but being there and being sort of the homunculus that's looking at the person in there. And to me, that seems not only modern, but almost postmodern. So let me talk about the idea of perspective and how radically Whitman changed the idea of perspective, not only in poetry, but in all of art. And this gets back to my idea of the bottleneck, because as far as I know, I think he was amongst the first to really do that. Yes, there were some things like Tristram Shandy, the novel, that had a little elements of that. But I think Whitman is the first guy to just fully go into the deep end of the pool. Let me start with Ed this time, if you would agree, and what are your comments?
Yeah, that's. I think that's a very interesting aspect of Whitman, and when you go to Crossing Brooklyn, particularly, a key point for me with the way that Whitman manipulates verb tense in really fascinating ways to create this illusion of flipping from his present into our past and into his future. And the way he manipulates that in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, so that as a writer we can, or as a reader we can feel ourselves move in and out of Whitman's time. Very aware of how to manipulate language to create these kind of metafictional illusions, these associations that we have often with postmodernism. I think of the way that Whitman, in creating that miraculous character, the main character, one of the two main characters of his work, the I and you, that in creating that you, Whitman is very aware of that English second person pronoun. You that we use in our language, unlike any other language, we use that second person pronoun to address our most intimate lover in our most intimate moments. We use it to address a complete stranger, and we use it to address one person, and to address the entire world. Very promiscuous pronoun, and it allows Whitman to create and capture all kinds of, think of as metafictional responses.
David Reynolds?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually he goes in both directions toward the use of the I, the first person, and also the release into the concrete world, almost unfiltered by a first person. Because in Song of Myself, a lot of it's dominated by the I, and everything is through the first person, which is pretty radical. But then there are long, long passages in which there's really no presence of either an I or a you. So I think that he's and that itself is quite pretty modern too, because it's almost like found art, so to speak. I mean, the poetry, the art of the commonplace, just everyday things. Almost looking forward to some modern poetry. So he's able to kind of oscillate between this filtration of everything through the I, and then this release really into the ordinary facts of life, almost they're only held together really by the rhythm of the lines themselves, and he uses parallelism and repetition and that kind of thing. But it's pretty remarkable.
You think about the last line of Song of Myself. I stopped somewhere waiting for you, and that there's such a promise there, and maybe some would see that as a threat. You're traveling on this road, and someone's out there waiting for you. But there is this sense with Whitman that he's inescapable, that he is always going to be with us. He's going to be in the bedroom with the bride and the bridegroom. He's going to be in our dreams. We're going to find him doing our chores. He'll always be there. He'll always be waiting for us. And yet, and this is where I think that there's an interesting sort of postmodern look, he's also going to elude us. We're going to go looking for him, as he tells us repeatedly throughout the Calamus poems, which some might say are his most personal poems. And yet we're going to go try to find him, and guess what? We're not going to get him. He's always going to be tantalizing us, and we think we're going to understand him, and then nope, he's escaped once again. So there is a little bit of gamesmanship there, and playfulness there, that I think we find, in 20th century writing.
It's a bit like the taunting that he does, for instance, "Whoever holds me now."
Yes.
Well, I don't know. I'm enough to read these. Maybe you better just shut this book and put it down. You need to be a little better if you're part of. I've always been the sort of postmodern aspect of Whitman. That one of the writers, the international writers, that was really intensely engaged with Whitman was Borges. It was Borges who had that Whitman's great experiment. And he said, "Ever done it, and probably no one ever." But to create that multiple Walt Whitman that simultaneously named as an I who lives in the 19th century, as a presence that lives on the page in the poem, and someone that the I in the poem expressed. That there's never been and never will be again, Borges says, that kind of, in Borges' mind, mythical character created. I mean, when we think of Borges' own fascination with the creation of worlds of fiction, it's interesting that he looks to Whitman as an early model.
I want to talk of another aspect of Whitman, actually two, and I want to read the first line from a poem that's not usually considered amongst Whitman's greatest or whatnot, but it's one of his songs, Song of the Answer. And the first line is, "Now listen to my morning's romanza, I tell the signs of the answerer." And in that, there's one line. There are two aspects of Whitman that are very interesting. The first is his use throughout his work of foreign and or faux foreign words, like romanza. He uses words like allans, recuerdo. He uses a faux Latinate word like presidentiad numbers of times. And then there's also, the first word is now, listen. With Whitman, there's always the recurrence of not just impassivity, but actual aggressiveness in grabbing you by sort of the collar and saying, "Listen to me." And both of those things, in a sense, are very striking about Whitman, because even though he's inviting people in to talk about things people haven't done before, he's still sort of littering his work with these things that could make lesser readers say, "No, I don't want to go into what romanza, presidentiad," and there's constant, "Listen to me, look at me." Let me talk about both of those aspects: the immediacy, the aggressive immediacy, and also the use of foreign words and these things that would make reading more difficult, especially for your average 19th century reader. Let me start with David Reynolds.
Well, there's a kind of authoritarian side to Whitman, because he, on one level at least, he really believed that he was the answerer. And why? Because he bought into the Emersonian, also partly Shelleyan and Wordsworthian, general romantic feeling about the poet as being the very, very highest human being, and the seer, the answerer. And he's definitely a salesman. He's selling something, but he really totally believes in what he's selling. And there's also a kind of a carnivalization of his language. He once said, I think, of Lisa Grass as a language experiment. He likes to coin words. He likes to combine English words with foreign words, creating a kind of democracy of a language, and at the same time dipping down and using slang. He was very proud that he was one of the first to use "so long" in his poetry, and to us that's a common phrase, but back then that was a little bit rare, particularly in poetry. So from slang to this kind of somehow ersatz a hybrid language that couples farm like camarado and presidentiat and so forth. It's part of his internationalization and his democratization, really, of language.
Yeah, and I would add about the use of foreign terms that in mind too, how in Whitman's time, New York streets were filled with language. They still are today, and that part of that ability that Whitman had, kind of openness to this sense that continually hearing foreign phrases that are gradually going to work their way into English. Part of what he loved about it was its the ability to simply absorb or terminology from other languages. Whitman's one of the formative influences in his early career was his 18 New Orleans, where he spent 3 in a truly polyglot environment, and I think that had a tremendous effect on him. So that he has a poem that "Salut au monde," salute to the world, and even as we read the title of the poem, you can feel the flipping out of English into a kind of internationalization.
David Blake,
I love that phrase from Song of Myself, the blab of the pave, the blab of the pave, and I think I agree with David and Ed. I mean, so on one hand you have the foreign phrases, and you have people like Henry James who say, well, one would regret all of Whitman's minuscule knowledge of these foreign phrases because they didn't seem to fit for James. But of course, James had nothing of the blab of the pave in his work, and it was something so distinct from anything that James was accomplishing. And so Whitman is somebody who is celebrating our ability, the poet's ability to regenerate language, but democracy's ability to regenerate language. I mean, he would love the way our contemporary democracy produces words like eye candy or clickbait or slacker. I mean, if any word would be for him, slacker, and how these words sort of come up from democratic discourse on the internet, and then they end up sort of in the OED. And I think that's something that he felt strongly was the poet's job to do, and as I said, more importantly, it was democracy's job to do it.
Yeah, and he really took task, this job, as David referring to it, he took it very seriously. You could see in his notebooks, he actually starts writing words and definitions streets. As he's wandering the street, one of the things he jots down in his are new that he hears, new phrases, new people slang. Writes an essay on it is a remarkable, powerful writing on the way language develops and works. He starts working with a theory of what he called real, the grammar that people speak on the streets, as opposed to the rules of grammar that supposedly tell us how the language is. Whitman's always much more interested in how it actually sounds in the streets. And he would keep actually beginnings of dictionaries of foreign phrases around him. Slang phrases on the docks when heard the sailors coming in from their latest trip. He would jot those things down, and oftentimes they books directly into his poem.
In the next segment, I want to talk about the Civil War and later years. But before we hit that, I want to end this segment talking about two things that have been mentioned before: homosexuality and sexuality in general. Let me just talk biographically, and then we'll talk about sexuality within the poetry. Is it pretty much? I mean, it's pretty much widely accepted that Whitman was likely homosexual. He claimed he had a woman down in New Orleans and fathered 8 or 10 kids or something, but a lot of people dismiss that. Uh, do we think now that he was definitely homosexual? Was he homosexual in action or just in yearning? Was he maybe asexual, or was he, or has he been misdiagnosed, if you will, all these years later? Let me start with David Reynolds.
Well, the term homosexuality was introduced in German in 1869, and it wasn't really used in English until the year of Whitman's death. Before that, it was called sexual inversion, and it wasn't really widely known, that word, to the public until it was used in the New York Times in the 1920s. And when Whitman was approached late in life by John Addington Symonds, who was a gay British writer, and said, by the Calamus poems, do you mean sexual inversion? And Whitman said, oh, those inferences are morbid, are damnable and all of that. And he said, my life has been jolly bodily, and I've sired 6 children. Now, he had not sired 6 children or any children that we know of. He talked of having had a sweetheart. That seems a little dubious. I mean, today it's recognized that he was homosexual. But the question is, how did he really look at himself, and why did he come out so strongly against someone like Symonds, other than simply trying to sort of cover up? And I think part of the reason is if you look at the Calamus poems, which to us look like really homosexual poems, completely about male same-sex love, they were allowed in books like Gems for Walt Whitman, which is a parlor table book that left out any suggestion of heterosexual love, even the mating of the eagles, the dalliance of the eagles, which really doesn't describe sex whatsoever, and yet it's sex between a male bird and a female bird. That was left out, whereas the Calamus poems, most of them were left in because he at least sold himself in his era as a comrade, a romantic comrade, and as a comrade, and there was a certain flexibility in same-sex relationships in 19th century American culture. The lack of the categories of hetero and homo and bisexual, the very lack of those categories gave rise to a certain flexibility. And Margaret Fuller, one of his contemporaries, said, there is no completely masculine man, there is no completely feminine woman. And the whole convention of Boston marriages, these women who lived together for a long, long time, and yet we're largely accepted as being kind of part of the convention. So I think that Whitman liked to think of himself as being part of the convention of his times, even though that when we look closely at his Calamus poems, you do sometimes feel a sense of a kind of isolation at the same time. I think he kind of varies between a self-aware isolation and then a kind of almost a shrill insistence on comradeship as the basis of patriotism and the basis of America and all of that. So it's pretty interesting. It's a very complex topic, but I think it's wrong to be presentist and to kind of impose our own views and our own political understanding of homosexuality on Walt Whitman. I really think that's mistaken.
Ed?
Yeah, I would agree that, as David pointed out, not only was homosexual not a term that Whitman would have been using during his lifetime, but neither was heterosexuality. And the terminology is here. It's a giant imaginative leap to try to picture oneself living in a world where homosexuality and heterosexuality are not active concepts. And as David mentioned, there was a slipperiness to political relationships in the 19th century that oftentimes was brought on by tended to sleep in the same bed together. If you would go to a tavern to stay up late, and you might join in a single bed with a couple of guys, and between members of the same sex was a much more commonplace thing. There was sodomy, which was a sin, but it was not a sin that attached itself to what we think of as gay sex or homosexual. It attached itself as well to certain heterosexual sex. And a gay historian like Jonathan Ned Katz, they've done really thorough investigations how sodomy law century, and it's very illuminating to put this all in relationship, because the Calamus poems were not the poems that were seen in the 19th dangerous poems, or very rarely were. It was the children of Adam, what we think of now as the heterosexual poems that were that caused the scandal. So what happened for gay out is that the crucial thing about Whitman and writing Alex, he seemed to be inventing a language of male affection, and that language of love was in a way a kind of proto invention of what came to be gay identity, that there could be a love between sexes that before had only been the convention of cross-genders. And the question has always been not Whitman gay, but when did Whitman become gay? And that gayness happens at different times in different cultures. Happened early in German, where Whitman was pathologized early on as an example of pathologized homosexuality. In the U.S., really sort of public, only poet in the 1960s, and was embraced by the post-Stonewall Revolution, America's gay poet.
David Blake, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I would just add to that, and agreeing with what everyone else has said. But think about what we gain because Whitman wasn't fixated as we are on the question of sexual identity. We get a poetry that captures the nature of sexual intimacy, in incredibly beautiful and graphic terms, in tremendous immediacy. We get a poetry that captures sexual anxiety and sexual loneliness with, again, equally beautiful and heart-wrenching terms. I mean, sex for Whitman is not simply all about celebration and the sort of honeyed experience of orgasm, as he refers to it. It's also filled with self-loathing and self-questioning and loneliness. And so I think one of the reasons why he is such a dramatically revolutionary poet of sexuality is because he's focused on the experience of sexuality rather than the identity focused on it.
Ed had mentioned the Children of Adam poems being more controversial in their day than the Calamus. And I just want to read 3 lines here. weapon shapely, naked, wan, head from the mother's bowels drawn, wooded flesh and metal bone, limb only one and lip only one. Those are the first three lines of Song of the Broad Axe. And the two words that come to my mind are Oedipus and motherfucker. Because, I don't even know if a 19th century mind could have even grasped what the implications, the duplicity of three lines like that. But my God, those are when you even think about it nowadays. If that was written in more contemporary slang, this is something that Jim Morrison and the Doors were getting censured about a century later. Let me just talk about the overt sexuality. Well, it's overt in a sense, but it's covered up that with the title "Song of the Broad Axe" right above those opening three lines, and then we digress away from that explicitness. But that's a very shocking opening to a poem that would have, the ladies of Boston's, knickers in a twist.
Yeah, well, I mean, it works both as a description of an axe, with the wood and also the axe as a weapon. But of course, as you just mentioned, it's totally phallic as well. What's great about Whitman is that he's able to use these phallic images, and even more than images. He's not really scared of mentioning the sexual organs, and yet he does it in a way that is shocking, yes, but from his own point of view, in a way cleansing. The fact that he's talking there both about a very natural thing, the axe, something that's used in that, for felling trees and so forth, and used in nature, but at the same time, a body part, the phallus. This fusion of nature with body parts is something that really runs throughout his poetry. And he didn't like actually sex when it was treated in the pornography of that day, which was full of lurid indirection. It was actually less explicit than his own poetry, and yet it was full of this kind of prurient indirection and kind of sort of, he said, oh, there's a pornographer over there. He's a New York reptile. He's a reptile, and he really he said, welcome is every organ and attribute of me. Not a particle or an inch of me will be vile. There's no part of my body that's vile. And in a way, he really wanted to get it out in the open. And he does that by sort of uplifting it and combining it with things like the broad axe.
Yeah, and I would add that what David just described is this amazing sort of slippage between the human physical body and the bodies of it's so common in Whitman's poetry. It leads to these amazing passages that when you read them feel unbelievably tense and erotic, yet are impossible times to discern just exactly what's happening and who's involved with it. I think of a poem like Solemn Sweet Organ, which eventually gets placed at the end of the Children of Adam section. But it's a poem of immense touching and very delicate moment of listening to a lover's pulse through the held up to the ear in bed. And it's a poem I've heard read at a wedding, and I've heard it read at a straight wedding. It's simply a love poem of physical affection.
David Blake, do you have a comment?
Sure. One of the great stories that we Whitman scholars like to tell and hear is the story of how Leaves of Grass at Harvard, in the Harvard Library in the 19th century, was kept in the biology library under lock and key because it was too scandalous as poetry, but it'd be something that students of anatomy would want to maybe look at. We tell that story with all good humor, but it is also very much a compliment to Whitman to think about the fact that he is embracing all of the body. He's not 1 inch is vile, as David had put it, and he's going to take us from the armpits through the loins and down to the feet, and all of that is going to be part of the poetry, both in its sexual part and then in not sexual part. I mean, as an old man, he starts writing and he talks about being constipated, which is remarkable that somebody would be writing a poem about that. But that is part of the experience of living as the human animal, and he's going to include that.
He lives in the body right to the day of his life. And
yes, that's right. Right.
And so many poets, like one that comes to mind immediately is Robert Creeley, who in their own late poem, came incredibly grateful for having opened the way and led the way to how old age is a body, live in it as a body.
On the other hand, you also get a poem like Shit Machine from Allen Ginsberg, but...
Ginsberg was another great lover of his old age poetry. I mentioned too with David Blake was talking about the being in the keeping leaves of grass in the biology library at the University of Iowa campus. We have 2 biology buildings connected by a sky bridge, and the architect who built that sky bridge, the one permanent line from which is at the heart of the sky connecting the 2 biology buildings, and it's grass is the journey work of the stars.
Well, let's end this segment. In the next segment, I want to talk about the Civil War and Whitman's later years, and we'll do that in a moment. Speaking with David Reynolds, David Blake, and Ed Folsom of Walt Whitman, certainly one cannot talk about Whitman without talking about the Civil War. We mentioned the Drum Taps segment of poems, When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, and Oh Captain, My Captain are probably the 2 most famous of his Civil War era poems. Whitman famously went to work as a nurse for the Union Army. I think he did some field work, but mostly he was in hospitals. Let me just start with biographically before we get to the poems. Let me start with Ed this time. What drove Whitman to become a nurse, and what was Whitman's views on slavery? Was he for the Union cause heartily?
Well, he certainly for the Union cause heartily. But the Union cause, of course, was not anti-slavery from the beginning. It was preservation of the Union, and Whitman was a very strong supporter of the preservation of the Union. In some ways, I think all of Whitman's is based on the idea of being able to live with difference, to live with complexity, and to live with contradiction. His famous lines from Song of Myself, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large, I can take foods. And that I is an I. It's the I that finds unity, diversity. And the Civil War attacked part of this. It was the great democratic experiment. Could the Union could democracy thrive with minorities and majorities? Could it thrive with division and contradiction and keep absorbing it into an overreaching unity? Whitman believed with every fiber of his body that this had to happen. If the Union broke apart, the thing he believed in terms of democratic future is shattered. And so he's a very strong supporter of the cause. But he also, throughout his life, would understand the Southern resistance. I think built into Whitman, David Reynolds alluded to this earlier, but built into Whitman is what's built into the American character. We've got the Declaration of Independence, which is that rebellious, resistant, says you can't tell me what to do. And then we have the Constitution. That is the agreed upon set of things that tell us what we can and cannot do. And Whitman has that built into his poetry. This is what you shall do, he says in the preface to Leaves of Grass. And what we shall do, not listen to what anybody tells us to do, including Whitman. But Whitman will tell us that is our constitutional responsibility. So to get back to the Civil War, he's a strong supporter of the Union. He certainly was a very strong anti-slavery person, but I would say much in the gradualist tradition, assuming that slavery in democratic evolution would simply at some point disappear, evaporate as such a vastly undemocratic idea that it couldn't continue to exist in a democracy. But very uneasy with the, as were many Northerners, with the turn the war took after 1863, when the Union began more precisely defining its goals as the abolition of slavery after the Emancipation Proclamation. Whitman had nothing to say about the Emancipation Proclamation. It's an interesting subject in Whitman, I think. But he's a very strong supporter. The Union cause for him was everything.
David Reynolds, if you want to go.
In his poetry, what's great about his poetry, particularly his early poetry, is the sense of an affirmation of total togetherness of people of different nationalities and ethnicities, including African American people and enslaved people and so forth. However, he feared the extremes of abolitionism, and that was one extreme. And he once said, "Be radical, be radical, be radical. Be not too damned radical." He said, "Don't be too damned radical." Anything that, as Ed just said, that would disrupt the Union, it was something that he objected to. So he was first and foremost a pro-union guy, and maybe secondarily an anti-slavery guy. He kind of made some of his abolitionist friends a little bit angry that he wasn't, and just as he wasn't as supportive of women's rights as we would have thought, and he was a little late coming to African American suffrage, the vote for African Americans, and so it's a little bit, I don't want to. There was a student at Northwestern who refused to sing an opera based on Whitman because he said, "No, Walt Whitman was a racist." Well, he was not a racist. He was not a racist. He came the closest of any poet in 19th century America to affirming racial equality. However, you have to sort of invert that and say everybody at that time, even Abraham Lincoln, at times expressed things that today would be considered conservative or racist. I mean, I'm talking about every white person, virtually every white person. I really haven't found anybody except maybe John Brown and possibly Lydia Maria Child. She was an abolitionist. But very, very few people went through their lives back then without expressing certain things that were a little bit racist. And Walt Whitman was no exception. But I will say he came the closest of anyone in his poetry, and even to this very day, to respecting African Americans and Native Americans as well.
When people do that kind of thing, well, they talk about like Lincoln being a racist, like, number one, no shit, but number two, that only makes, for example, the things that they did in abolishing slavery all that more impressive, that they overcame their internal ignorances.
Yeah.
But David Blake, what is your comment, Ray, the Civil War?
I agree. I don't think Whitman was any more racist than many of the abolitionists and people who were for the Union. As a poet, his default position was that of a white man, and even as he's writing to represent all of us, he's including everybody. He's including African American characters. He's including women, but his voice is not going to be able to ventriloquize them. And the few times that he does try to offer a poem in an African American's voice, it doesn't work. He can't get outside of himself. He's not a novelist. He's a poet who speaks out of his subject position, we might say, which is that of this white man. So whatever his politics were, the experience of others is something that he is going to see, and he's going to affirm it, and he's going to put it into language, but he's not going to be able to sort of take over that identity and create a character that's beyond his own experience, and that's a limitation. But I think it's a limitation that comes both as an artistic limitation as well as a political one.
For a guy who wrote all of these long poems, the songs of this, the songs of that, and whatnot, it's interesting that the Civil War poems, both Drum Taps and the Memories of President Lincoln, When Lilacs Last in the Dahlia Bloom is easily the longest of those poems. It's maybe about 2.5 pages. I believe every other poem is a page or less, and sometimes significantly less. And it's interesting, they seem to just focus on one aspect: a soldier dying, looking out over a battlefield, hearing something creeping. It's almost as if Whitman takes some macro thing and then decides to bring it down, rather than taking the micro and expanding it out when he's talking about war or whatnot. Any comments on that? Let me start with you, Ed.
It's fascinating to see what happens to Whitman's poetry during the Civil War. As he's experiencing the war, notebooks, which before had been notebooks that he carried with him on the streets of New York, jotted down this burgeoning, expanding, wildly diverse of urban experience. During the Civil War, he's books with him into the hospitals, and he's at the bedsides of, by his own count, 100,000 soldiers over the course of the couple of years that he was, the last couple of years of the war, when he was Washington, D.C. hospitals. And it's in those notebooks that see the origins of so many of the war poems. What a soldier tells him about an experience in a battle, or an experience on the march in the woods, or something about his particular illness, or Whitman jotting down notes about what he sees a wound dresser doing as the wound dresser deals with the horrific wounds and the after effects of amputation. And note in the notebooks often you can see image by image, line by line, poem we emerge out of the voices of those soldiers. And I think one of the interesting things to me about the Drum Taps poems is that the eye, that big absorptive eye, becomes much more of a persona, an eye that takes on the persona of particular Civil War soldiers with particular experiences that Whitman himself did not have, but which he heard and listened to and ventriloquized as of the Civil War. They're a very, very different kind of poem, very different eye than the Whitman eye that we had before the Civil War.
Yeah, I mean, if I can sort of speak to that a little bit, I think that, in a way, once Lincoln comes along, Whitman doesn't feel that the same all-embracing eye is necessary, because what happens is that in 1856, after the 1855 edition doesn't do that well, Whitman says, well, I hope that out of the West, we need a completely different kind of president. We need a bearded guy out of the West, who was part of nature and sort of, who was a backwoodsman and everything. So when Lincoln comes along, Whitman, sort of said, this is the guy, a rail splitter, flat boatman, just a common, and more than that, he combined a lot of the qualities that the eye of the 1855 edition had. He was humorous, he was tender, he was compassionate, he was very much of a leader. He had a certain candor and a certain honesty about him. He kind of covered a lot of the qualities that the 1855 eye had. And so we see the retreat of that 1855 eye, and it's replaced by a more fragmented kind of eye, but also a first person that now is a little more focused on, well, the events of the war, and also Lincoln himself. In those two great Lincoln poems, "Oh Captain, My Captain," it's really about the captain. It's about Lincoln, my captain, and now you're fallen and dead. You've guided the ship of state, and now you're dead on the ship. It's not really so much about the eye. It's about Lincoln. And then in the Lilacs poem, what happens is that there's a real sort of generalization and a retreat of the first person. So Lincoln himself becomes the Western Star, and the poet becomes the solitary thrush, the bird in the woods who's singing this song of death. And then it's a poem full of these general images of nature and about the nation. And it's a real retreat of that brash first person that we saw. Because, and then for the rest of his life, one of his most popular things to do is to give the Lincoln lecture, the death of Abraham Lincoln. So he's constantly looking back at Lincoln as being this kind of ideal American that once he hoped his own first person would have been.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, and Whitman, after the war, he certainly wanted to reconstruct the U.S., to recapture that sense of union and that sense of future, but he never again could recapture the ecstasy of that absorptive eye, the eye that we feel is the American eye. I think one of the great achievements of Leaves of Grass in the year of the Civil War, in all the reasons, one of the great accomplishments and the genius of Whitman is that he never got rid of the pre-Civil War poems. And our experience, and always remember the experience of having the power, pre-Civil War voice, mingling and mixing with and altering our of and balancing our experience of the shattered, divided post-Civil voice. I always think of we were talking earlier about and racism and race, and I think of how in the 20th century we have poets like Hughes or June Jordan, or in our own time, the 21st century, Yusef Naka, African American poets who looked to Whitman with a great deal of admiration. And Langston Hughes, had to actually defend Whitman against critics who came to Hughes and said, "How can you support this guy? Listen to the racist statements that he made late in his life." He said, "No, my God, if we only listen to the worst of our poets have said to us, we'll have nothing. You always have the best of what our poets have said." And the best of Whitman was that voice, that I, that allowed Langston Hughes to say, "I too am America."
Another really interesting example there with Langston Hughes is the contemporary playwright Anna Devere Smith, because Anna Devere Smith's method as a playwright is she goes to communities in crisis and interviews all sorts of people in these communities, and then and then creates a dramatic piece in which she, in many of her pieces, not all of them, but she in many of these pieces will then present them and act them out, regardless of their race or their gender. And so you have this African American woman who is playing a Chinese grocer in Los Angeles, or playing a Chicano gang member, or playing a white police chief, and this is all sort of rooted in Whitman and that whole interplay about the I and the you. But it's updated, and the default here, which is so interesting for our times, is it's an African American woman who is inhabiting the voices and experiences of others, and she's talked very eloquently about how that's all rooted for her in Whitman.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Eddie. Do you have comments?
I was that there's a new project that is appearing this year online called Alabama, and it's a film project in which there are 52 films, one for each section of the final edition of A Song of Myself, all of them read by wild variety, diversity of people in Alabama, from all walks of races, all religions, reading these poems and interacting with these poems as they live out their. The fascinating updating of the project, as David Blake was just talking about, that I really encourage people to take a look at.
Let me talk about rhetoric in Whitman. I've often said to poets that Whitman is one of the few poets, when he's at his best, that his excess, stuff that would not work in most other people's writing or poetics, works with Whitman because he cultivates to such an extent. Having said that, he released 7 versions of Leaves of Grass, 1855, 56, 61, 67, I think 71, 81, and 91, the deathbed edition. And most people generally, I think most scholars say that probably the 71 or maybe the 67, the middle life editions, have the best poems, because what he did, he probably went to the effect of just over embroidering. He did sort of what W.H. Auden later did, in that he went back and fucked up some of his poems, adding just a little bit too much here and there. And so that most people look at the 67 or the 71, 72 editions as being the definitive best. Let's talk about his obsessive need to just revise. And do all of you agree, for example, that he probably would have been better had he written new poems, perhaps? Or was he just running out of gas, do you think? In the last 20 years, he was just embroidering too much. Let me start with you, David Reynolds.
Well, I do like the middle editions a lot, and the reason I like them is that he includes the clusters, the organization that he had introduced in the 1860 edition. And I think that he produces poetry that, or he revises his poetry in a way that it's a little more. The 1855 edition, which I love, and I did a facsimile, virtual facsimile reprinting of it, and I love it and everything. And, it's great. However, he intentionally violates punctuation there. It's mainly ellipses. There are no commas, and he knew punctuation very well. He's intentionally trying to, in a way that's very pre-modern, but I think for most readers, including myself, it's kind of nice to see a more conventional, I hate to use the word conventional, but more normal use of punctuation and a kind of organization and structure that we do get. And the 1855 editions, the poems aren't even titled. Again, some people love that. I like it myself, but I can see where other people sort of like titles. Ed mentioned the fact that he doesn't like he really admires the fact that Whitman did not take out the Civil War poems, and I admire that about the later editions. I also admire the fact that he didn't really back down too much on, for example, Song of Myself. I mean, he left that, he divided it into 52 sections and so forth, and somewhat conventionalized the punctuation, but the radicalism is still there. Some of the phrases perhaps are a little less shocking, but in general, I really admire the way he never gave up on that initial vision. And Ed and David, do you agree with that fundamentally?
Yeah, I agree with that. My own feeling, I really agree with Whitman when he was asked late in his life his own view of the different editions of Leaves of Grass and which one he preferred, because a number of his disciples at that point already had decided 1855 was a very special edition. And Whitman had always expressed that he was embarrassed by that edition because the type it was bad and it had been sloppily put together. And people say, well, but it had those big pages, those fit your lines perfectly. Whitman would say, I never liked that big page. I don't want to go back to the big page on the smaller page. But what he finally said was, look at those editions as like people look at their children. I love them all. I can't between them. They all have their strengths and their weaknesses. And I feel the same way. They really, for me, are very different. They respond to a different graphical moment. They respond to a cultural moment. And they respond to a different historical moment. And you can see that in each of those editions. And I love moving from one to another. You can now go on the online archive, read each edition yourself. You can read the poems in the edition. In Whitman, when he started, was developing a poetics upon the line. Once he invented the long line, that unit, and they could be interchangeable. He sometimes would cut up his poem a lot, and then he'd move the lines around until he had an arrangement that he liked. The one thing that didn't was the line, but moving of those lines could change, and you still had basically the same poem, just slightly different emphasis. And late in his life, what he was doing was the same thing, except he was working with poems instead. He was moving poems around clusters. He was moving everything around and recreating things. And every time you read a different edition of Leaves of Grass, I think you get a very different sense of how that book works. So I don't see it as a single book revised. I see it as really 6 very different editions, very different books that respond to very different circumstances.
David Blake, do you have a comment?
Yeah, it's been said that a great poem is never finished; it's only abandoned. And I think that to a certain extent fits Whitman, but he wasn't willing to abandon it. He was going to keep going back and keep going back, and by the end of his life, with all of those editions and all of those poems that have been shaped and reshaped, he begins to identify this with a life, and he presents it to us as a life. This is an outcropping of my years in the middle of the 19th century, and so in that way he defines for us, how to look at Leaves of Grass, which is this life's work. My personal preferences as the reader go towards those middle editions, like David. I love the 1860 edition. Just love it. Though, I have such respect for the way he creates a sense of this is what poetry is, and this is what poetry in a democracy is it's a life's work, and it begins when you're a young man at 34, and it goes until the very end, and that's what the book has to contain. So my personal preferences don't matter here as much as the artistic vision that he creates and gives for us.
Yeah, I think the 1860 edition, one thing that makes it a special edition is that the historical stakes are the very in that. I mean, I think it's an edition where you can really feel Whitman hoping to his book powerful enough actually is going to stop a civil happening. And, it's hard to imagine a greater historical 1960 Leaves of Grass. It makes it, for me, a very special edition to look at. But, when we think of a lot of people believe that Whitman did a revision that improved the poem, that made revisions that somehow his poetry, and if you really look closely, wrong. He may have more revision, and then that strengthened, but, Out of the Cradle, Rocking was written out of the rocked cradle. And I think there are very few people who would prefer the rocked cradle. Well, some people do. Betsy, out of the rocked cradle better than out of the cradle endlessly rocking. So.
Well, let me talk about Whitman in relation to two other American writers that he's often talked to. The first is Emily Dickinson, and I'm actually going to do a show on Dickinson in a couple of weeks. And to me, they are often portrayed as the yin and yang. I think in this way, it might be so. Whitman was from the self looking outward at others, whereas Emily Dickinson was looking inward. If Whitman was a visionary, Emily Dickinson, if you want to argue, was an anti-visionary in a sense. What do you think about them as sort of the yin and yang of 19th century American poets? Because they are inevitably seen as the two sort of twin towers of 19th century American poetry. Let me start with you, David Reynolds.
Well, I really see Emily Dickinson as more centripetal and Whitman is more centrifugal, or the balance between centripetal and centrifugal are very different in them. With Walt Whitman, he asserts the first person I. At the same time, he's always extending outward into the world around him. And Emily Dickinson, in a way, her poetry is so different stylistically. It follows a standard hymn meter, tetrameter meter, and it is. But to say that he's a public, usually it's said that he's a public poet and she's a private poet. To some degree, that's true. She only left her state of Massachusetts once. She generally was around her home. She wasn't. Only 10 poems were published in her lifetime. She wrote 1,800 poems. Only 10 were published in her lifetime. And when she died, no one really knew. She didn't have the reputation yet. So she didn't have this kind of public publicizing instinct. At the same time, she was very, very open to her contemporary culture. So a lot of the kind of same ideas that Whitman treats, sexuality, gender issues, even the Civil War, death, God and the mystery of the universe, a lot of those are actually shared by Emily Dickinson, albeit kind of boiled down into this very compressed poetry that it's centrifugal in its meaning because it's exploding outwards, but at the same time it's centripetal in its statement. It's all gathered inward into these taut and very resonant images, a very, very different kind of texture than Walt Whitman's poetry. And Dickinson once said, I've heard of Mr. Whitman's poetry, and I've heard it's rather vulgar, and yet she herself could write a poem like Wild Nights, which was full of sexual fantasy, to be sure. And so she herself was not without a certain erotic charge in her own poetry.
Ed, how about you? What are your take on Whitman and Dickinson?
I'm with the Whitman-Dickinson sort of originating myth of American poetry. That is, what other poetic tradition? What Audrey and Rich referred to the grandmother and grandfather. We've got these these two complementary, opposing poets make two very different American poetry. Expansive, open, one innovation, and the other effective, confessional of poetry. But we've got two unmarried, one a man, one a woman, two poets who had strong affectional to people of their own gender. Two, in their own way, radical poets, writing really radical kinds of. One, in Dickinson's, I think, so radical that Thomas Wentworth Higgins, whom she gave her poetry at the editing poet, kept holding up, but in publishing. In a way, you can of Emily Dickinson as Thomas Wentworth Higginson's protege, and you can think of Whitman as Ralph Waldo Emerson. These two towering figures, Higginson and Emerson, sort of a lifelong battle to which of their proteges would carry transcendental into the 20th century. And by the end of the 19th century, Higginson seemed for a while to Emerson, but things were beginning to shift, and it wasn't really until the 1950s, I think, when we get the full range of Dickens poetry in the Thomas Johnson edition, and where simultaneously we get the 1855 Leaves of Grass. At the end of the 50s, the 1860 Leaves of Grass reprinted, and start to get a sense of how wild Leaves of Grass was, and we begin to have this that we suddenly have been blessed with incredibly powerful double edition that now has become our originary story in poetry. But it's really a story that long history created.
David Blake, you have a comment?
Yeah, it's interesting that those two would be the ones who descend to us when the most popular poet of the era was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And Longfellow had the academic credentials, and he had the influence. He had popular credentials. I mean, Longfellow in many ways had a lot of what Whitman might have liked, except Whitman didn't want to write that kind of poetry. I mean, Longfellow was known for his abolitionist work. Longfellow did write poems and books of poems that were trying to head off the Civil War, just like Whitman, but and in one sense more effectively in the political arena than Whitman. But both of those poets, Whitman and Dickinson, find themselves knowing Longfellow, but not really knowing each other, right? And they descend to us, as the poet Donald Hall says, as our impossible marriage between Emily and Walt. One of the things I think is interesting when you think about the two of them is think about the prospect of translating them. What would it take to translate Whitman? And then what does it take to translate Dickinson? And what is lost? I think Whitman would be an easier poet to translate because it's so less. The work is so spacious, right? And it relies so much less on puns and half meanings and off rhymes and all of those things that Dickinson does in her compressed lyric. So stylistically, they're very different, and they have such a different way of addressing the world. And yet, at the same time, I think we can say that both find a way to revolutionize the lyric as a form for America. And they both go back to that de Tocquevillian comment, not that they were thinking of de Tocqueville, but they both find their way towards that notion that art in a democracy and literature in a democracy is going to be about the self, and they both inhabit that and find a way to shape the lyric and re-energize the lyric for what America would become.
It's interesting you mentioned Longfellow. I thought about Eugene Field that before Dickinson was published and after Whitman sort of faded, Eugene Field was the most widely read poet of the 1880s and 90s, and he's, no one really remembers him except someone like me. But I wanted to talk about another person. I mentioned Herman Melville as sort of an almost exact contemporary of Whitman, and he to me is even more integral to thinking about Whitman than Emily Dickinson is, and that's because to me they are truly opposite ends of the spectrum. With published writers who have written poetry and prose, usually if one is great in prose, they suck in poetry and vice versa, and Melville and Whitman embody that. When I think of Melville, of course you think of Moby Dick, you think of maybe Benito Cereno, Billy Budd, Bartleby, and then you look at his turgid, crusty, unliving verse, and I think of people like great playwrights like Eugene O'Neill and Tennessee Williams, who also wrote terrible poetry. Lauren Isley, a science writer who I think is the greatest science essayist of all time, wrote mediocre poetry. And then you have Whitman, who is great in poetry, and then you look at turgid things like Specimen Days or Democratic Vistas, and he didn't know how to even convey solid arguments without falling back upon that rhetoric. And probably the person that comes most to mind is the Czech German language poet Rainer Maria Rilke, who would write these breathtakingly great poems on the spirit, and then write mawkish crap like Letters to a Young Poet. And so when I look at something like Melville and Whitman, it's just amazing to me how Melville could be so great in poetry, in prose rather, and his poetic prose is so poetic, and his actual poetry is lacking. And on the other hand, Whitman could write in what a lot of his early critics certainly said wasn't really poetry, but sort of prose poetry, could be so poetic, and yet his ability to argue or write in prose, especially by the time of his later prose, and I'm not even talking about his early novel or whatnot, is just so unlike the poetry. Let me just talk about that kind of divide with a lot of writers. Let me start again with David Reynolds. Do you think that there is this sort of thing where the poets find it exceedingly difficult to succeed in prose if they're great in poetry, and vice versa?
Yeah, well, I think if you look at Melville, he was a great fiction writer of sort of a second-rate poet. I mean, I think his poetry is maybe underrated a little bit. Emerson, who was a wonderful essayist, and then as a poet, didn't really fully succeed either. Thoreau was a wonderful essayist and didn't write fiction or much poetry himself. So a lot of it's just a matter of the way they kind of responded to the world emotionally and sort of artistically. I think all of us have our own specialties and our own way of kind of responding to the world. Some people look at me and they say, "Why don't you write a popular novel? Why don't you write a novel? Or why don't you even write popular history or something like that?" And it's just my makeup to write the kind of books that I do, and it just kind of comes out of me. I think Emily Dickinson, in a way, had a great attitude, and so did Walt Whitman. They wrote the way they felt about the world. They saw the world poetically, and when they tried to inhabit something else, it came out as something artificial. I don't think that Whitman's prose is really that bad. I guess maybe because I'm a Whitman scholar and I love reading Specimen Days and November Boughs and all of that. At the same time, I'll be the first to admit it's not really great prose. But for someone who's interested in Whitman, it's very interesting. I think Democratic Vistas is, again, extremely interesting, whether it's a really coherent, wonderful essay? Probably not. But his poetry, in a way, capitalizes on the kind of lack of perfect coherence. Because his best poetry, in a way, is sort of all over the place. And it kind of captures the variety of life. And when you try that really in an essay, it's very hard to do because an essay really demands the thesis and sort of a logical development of an argument. So, yeah, it's very, very interesting.
Yeah, I would basically agree with that. Although I think I'd go even further than David Reynolds in saying I think some of Whitman's prose is not only underwritten. I think I think Memoranda during the war, the civil specimen days, is some of the best Civil War writing by anyone who's lived during the Civil War. In a way, it's only the last 30 or 40 years we're beginning to learn how to read as we've become much more accustomed to the memoir as a literary genre worth thinking about and investigating. Memoranda during the war has been picked up. I think there's a weirdness about Whitman's prose that is a bit as intriguing as the weirdness of his poetry. I think his continual use of parentheses in prose to never allow himself to say something straightforwardly without thinking it at the moment that he's is a habit of mind that when you begin to in the spirit of it becomes a remarkably powerful habit of you're thinking about something as slippery as democracy and its future. Whitman thought of himself as equally a prose writer and a poet. In a book like Two Rivulets, he actually puts poetry and prose on the same one rivulet of poetry, one prose, and they speak to one to the other right on the page. It's a typographical experiment as much as it is a thought experiment. But he's got to remember that 1855 Leaves of Grass begins with a long prose preface. Will have found one of the really powerful and inspiring ever.
David, do you have a comment? David?
Yeah. Well, I would say that the Melville people are organizing, and they're working hard to show that Melville should be up there in the sort of now a triumvirate of great poets. So, in a couple of years, you may find you've got some Melville people on who are really working. I mean, I know they're organizing. I'm not kidding; they are organizing.
And I've read them, and I can take them on. He's not in. I mean, I'm
take them on. But I think, and I do admire a lot of Melville's work. I recently read all of Clairol, all 18,000 lines, and Leaves of Grass it is not, but wow, there were some amazing passages in there. And one of the things that book reminded me about Melville is that Melville knew character. He just created incredibly memorable characters, and whether that's in fiction, from Bartleby to Ahab to Benito Cereno or Mesa Delano, more so, or whether that's in his poetry, somebody like Rolfe. The characters are so important, which makes sense for somebody who spent so much time at sea as a sailor and telling stories. And Whitman's greatest character, and this is something that Ed pointed out earlier, Whitman's greatest character was himself. And his second greatest character was us, the you. And the poem is the proper vehicle for that. A novel about Walt Whitman is just going to fall flat. But that lyric address from the I to the you allows him to bring in those two characters along with the sets of song.
Another aspect that Whitman shared with Melville was sort of the shine coming off the rose in his final years. The last 20 or so years, his work was less read. He then eventually died of a combination of things, pneumonia, tuberculosis, etc. The difference was, though, whereas Melville had to wait until the centenary of his birth in 1919 for Moby Dick to get republished, and that brought back his fame. There were still people like an Oscar Wilde who came across the ocean to visit, sort of a pilgrimage to meet Whitman. Thomas Eakins, the great painter, famously was friends with Whitman. And then it was not quite as long. I think the rise of modernist poetry in the late first decade of the 20th century sort of brought Whitman back onto the table. So let's talk about his death and his legacy and how it's risen over the last century or so. Would you agree that Whitman did not have as long a period of more abundity creatively or critically as Melville? And what do you think kept it alive? Was it the fact that he had people like Oscar Wilde and Thomas Eakins as, if not acolytes, certainly fans? David, if you want to go, Reynolds first.
Well, yeah, I mean, what happened with Whitman was actually he became sort of increasingly well known toward the end of his life. So people like Oscar Wilde and Thomas Eakins, pretty famous people, would come and visit him. Andrew Carnegie praised him. I don't think he was always praised for the reasons that we do. There was a so-called church in England around his poetry, and he became a kind of cult figure among people. And he also became known as the good, great poet, almost a kind of a Santa Claus figure, because of his work in the Civil War. And that was kind of a manufactured image to some degree, but he sort of became a little more acceptable to the mainstream. At the same time, however, he was going through a series of strokes, and so physically, in a way, he couldn't relish, let's say, his celebrity to the degree he might have earlier. He eventually ended up in a wheelchair and had to be wheeled to these events, but he was increasingly revered. It's true that it really wasn't until the modern period that he was fully appreciated in the sense that he is today, because back then they tended to appreciate him for maybe different reasons. Melville, of course, dies in 1891 and gets virtually no publicity. A little paragraph. He once wrote a book called Typee and Umu, and not even a mention of Moby Dick or anything like that. So Melville, and he leaves this unfinished novella, Billy Budd, when he dies. So he's not recognized whatsoever. So Melville doesn't enjoy anything like the celebrity that Walt Whitman enjoys toward the end of his life.
David Blake, if you want to go, pick up on celebrity.
They really follow the opposite trajectories, don't they? I mean, Whitman starts out and he's having such a hard time getting attention, and his narrative ends. He dies in Camden, and he's poor. Is surrounded by admirers. I don't mean in the room at the time of his death, but he knows he has readers. He knows he has admirers, and some of that is from his own good publicity. And one of the things that made it was very useful for him is when he started to exaggerate the lack of response that he had to his work. And as an old man, he became very effective at creating what Leo Brody has called the sanction of neglect. That here's Walt Whitman, this great national treasure, and he's being mistreated by the Americans, and that may have been his most effective promotional strategy. But the time that he dies, he knows there are people in England, he knows there are people here in the U.S. who are interested in his work and who are going to keep that project going on.
But David, the point I was trying to make, though, is that while it's true that he did have a name value, if you look at the anthologies published from the 1880s through maybe the early modernists, about 30 years, say 1880 to 1910, it really wasn't until Pound basically got a hold of American poetry. And he, for whatever you want to say about Ezra Pound, he was quite demotic in promoting Whitman and promoting Robert Frost, people who were very different from him. Then we start seeing in the 19 teens and 20s Whitman becoming an anthology staple. That's what I was talking about.
But I see where you want to go, and yeah, I think you're absolutely right with Pound and William Carlos Williams is clearly somebody who is very consciously putting himself in Whitman's camp. I mean, the modernists had a kind of cool relationship to Whitman. He certainly was not T.S. Eliot's favorite American poet. So you might even say it has to wait until the 50s where Whitman really starts to gain some momentum.
Ed?
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think that Whitman suffered during the period of when the value of a poem was earned and could be read for its moments of ambiguity, and a whole reading practice of poetry years that made Whitman look like a relatively shallow, uninteresting poet. Whitman was kept alive for many by a sort of radical underground reading him and talking about him, and writers like Michael Gold and Emma Goldman and Muriel Rukeyser and Meredith Lesueur, and there's a kind of fascinating Woody Guthrie, fascinating subculture of Whitman alive outside of the S. Eliot-dominated literary community. But even someone like T.S. Eliot had virtually nothing but negative things to say about Whitman. Did say that when Whitman talks about Lyle, everything falls away, and a great poet. And I think it's I think Eliot had his own psychologically reasons for attracted despite him to Whitman, and I think The Wasteland has and can be read as a very interesting response.
Well, let's end this segment, and in the final segment, I'll give you closing remarks and talk about just Whitman critically going into the future. We'll do that in a moment. Wrapping up a discussion of Walt Whitman, let me just give you each a minute or two closing remarks. Where do you think Whitman is going to go scholarship-wise or critically in the future? Let me start with Ed and go the other direction this time. So, Ed, what are your final thoughts on Whitman and into the future?
Well, I think this is we're entering a golden age of literary discovery for the 19th century. I think the two Whitman books that have been discovered in the last year, Manly Health and Training and novel Jack Engel, are just the beginning of a really remarkable new period of our 19th century American authors more full as we through the digital of 19th century newspapers and periodicals. So much that's been is coming forth and is going forth the more these resources get digitized, and I think archival research and online archives are going to make major 19th century American writers more and more interesting, be finding more and more responses to them that we did not know existed in the past, more reprints of their works that we didn't exist in the past. Now have just in the last year, thanks to the work of Stephanie Block, knowledge that over 3 reprintings of Whitman's short stories occurred in the 40s and 50s. His early, in fact, was better known, widely read than we'd ever known before. And I think kinds of revelations important and lead a kind of new age of archival research thanks to the digitization of materials.
Okay, David Blake, a final comment about Whitman from you?
I am really grateful to be a Whitman scholar in the age of digitization, and grateful to Ed and Ken Price for all that they've done putting these archives out there. I mean, I think the idea that we can all sit here and talk about what our favorite editions are and what Whitman does in 1876 or 1881 is really a great testament to the Whitman archive, and the fact that we can have students who can take on those projects too. I mean, I teach undergraduate students mostly, and they can take on these projects and look at different editions of the works, which is just going to be, a tremendous benefit going forward. I think culturally, I hope Whitman grows more and more important. I recently taught Claude Rankine's great book, Citizen, and Rankine makes this wonderful distinction between the self, the historical self, and the ways in which that impacts African Americans in American society, and obviously you can extend out of that to talk about many of the diverse people in American society. And I think Whitman provides a language and a vision there for many different types of people, and many people who have different historical selves and obviously different selves to sort of to find themselves in that voice. Now, I'm not going to call it a founding voice because many people don't recognize it as a founding voice, but nonetheless, they can find themselves in that voice and lead to their own songs of themselves, as you might describe Citizen to be. So I think it's going to be more and more important to us as we become more and more diverse.
Final word to David Reynolds.
Yeah, well, I agree that Whitman scholarship has entered a new phase thanks to the digitalization that has been going on, both what Ed and Ken are doing at the Walt Whitman Archive, but also the online accessibilities of 19th century newspapers, and you can search them so easily, and it's just fabulous. It feeds into what I call reconstructive criticism, which is trying to reconstruct as fully as possible the historical and cultural context of the great writers of the past, so that we don't fall into the trap of imposing today's vision on them, but we try to recreate their time and culture. At the same time, I think that we should allow Walt Whitman to speak to us, and I like to see Walt Whitman when he enters popular culture, as in the recent Volvo ad, in which the song "The Open Road" is quoted, and there are a variety of ways in which Walt Whitman does enter culture. I wish that he would enter it a little more, because we live in a time right now that is maybe the most divided time since the Civil War, and we really need Walt Whitman's voice with us. And there's a part of me that wishes that poetry could be a little bit less on the shelf than it is, and Walt Whitman would have definitely wanted this too. And toward the end of his life, that's what he struggled with as well. Well, I'm kind of a celebrity here, but I really want to be kind of integrated into American life. And I had this almost Whitman-esque and Emersonian hope that somehow his vision people will gain access to his vision. I think the only way that it can be done is, in a way, through the popularization of it and through the spreading of Whitman on the internet, which people like Ken and Ed and others are doing. I think that's the best we can do. And through dialogues like this, whatever little steps that we can take to get the word out about Walt Whitman's integrative vision. He overcame such division in his own culture, and also serious problems within his family, what other people consider problems within his own family. to create a basically affirmative vision. And it seems to me that if that vision can be shared today, it would be just wonderful.
Well, thanks to all of you for your time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dan.